McGill is undoubtedly one of a handful of universities that are recognized all over the world, but don't come to the McGill MBA looking for tradition, whether it's AI, data analytics, design thinking. This is intelligent management for the future. And it's my pleasure to welcome John-Paul Ferguson. John-Paul is both a professor and associate professor of organizational behavior, but also the academic director of the MBA program. John-Paul, it's lovely to have you with us. A distinguished academic career, your PhD at MIT, and now in this leadership role at McGill and the Des Hotels School. What do you most enjoy about that leadership role?
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for having me. I think graduation, which I have learned as an American in Canada, is always called convocation, has just happened a week or so ago at McGill. And I will be honest with you that convocation is probably the thing that I enjoy the most. And the reason I say that is because that is the day when you can see the hard work in that leadership position paying off. Because, and I will refer, just because the cohort that just graduated is the last one that, for example, started during the pandemic. And we had a huge amount of work during the pandemic to move classes online so that students could still begin their MBA, even as they had visa delays and the like, and then we brought them back in. And so to be there with students who were happy to be graduating, but also, and this had not occurred to me, for example, until that day at convocation, when we suddenly 2 years ago had to take students remote for 4 weeks before we could start classes in the classroom. Of course, most of them by default ended up back at home with their families for those 4 weeks before they arrived. So I had parents showing up saying, we know the changes that you made in order that our children could start school, right? And so seeing that payoff and seeing these people starting the next phase of their life, like that's when it really feels worth it. And it's just a larger part of what I enjoy about being a program director is I get to really see these people all the way through their journey, from what their aspirations are when they start, where they're going when they finish. And it's very rewarding.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a little bit about everything that you're fitting into the journey, taking them out of their comfort zone, skills, personal confidence. But starting with the McGill MBA,
of course,
and how you like to describe the business school.
I think that there are two key ways I like to think about the business school at McGill. One of those is, and I take this term from our students, that many of them like to call it a swing school, by which they mean that we are one of the type of schools that has often specialized in students who are making some of the big transitions associated with an MBA. We often talk about there's the change in firm, there's the change in career, there's the change in geography, and so on.
Right.
We are the most internationalized MBA in Canada. And so about 70% of our students, for example, every year come from outside North America. And so they're doing that geography and often industry and firm change simultaneously. And I think partly because we have a very small cohort size, and we can provide personalized career advice and coaching, we are often seen as one of the places where, as students who are coming to North America with that idea, can basically begin to take advantage of a pre-existing network of alumni and classmates and so on to build their careers in Canada. And then for the students who are Canadian, who are starting in the program at McGill, for many of them, they aren't changing geography, but there's still often that industry change.
Right.
And because of a dense alumni network and because of that personalized career advice, I think it's one of the things that we have developed a reputation for within Canada. So a swing school is the first answer. The other, which I can say fairly briefly, is I really do think of business schools in Canada, and McGill among those, as we get to be engines of socioeconomic mobility. More so, I think, even than many schools south of the border. And I say that because both business schools remain somewhat more affordable in Canada for many students, but also there are no legacy admissions at McGill, for example. And so when we are looking at students, we're looking at their prior job performance, their academics, and the rest. And I really do feel like we provide an opportunity for a step change in terms of people's sort of career, financial, and professional aspirations.
Right. Sometimes I just think of it as cool Canada. It is such a popular destination for international students. That's reflected. You mentioned, you're number one for the percentage of international students. You're number one for the percentage of international faculty. You're number one for the level of international mobility. Everything that you described. We'll look at other measures of diversity where you're also number one. But in terms of the MBA program itself, which can be done in either a more intensive 1 year or the traditional 2-year format, you bring in, the minds of Henry Mintzberg and describe the MBA program and perhaps its particular flavor. We said earlier, don't come to the McGill MBA looking for tradition.
I think that, like many MBAs, you raised two things there, Matt, and I'd like to sort of expand on each of them. The first about the program length is just worth stressing at the beginning, because this can be different for folks. We face an interesting market structure. And if you're getting an MBA, you should get used to people talking about market structures, in that the demands of a typical Canadian student and a typical international student are different, in that Canadians are often looking for shorter program lengths these days in MBA programs, whereas international students who are often hoping to come to Canada want a longer program because this is part of immigrating to Canada.
Right.
And I fully support this. I'm an immigrant to Canada myself. I'm American. And Canada is a country that does not work without robust international immigration. And it is what makes us as strong as we are. And so we want to serve both of those markets. And so we do offer a flexible program length. But part of that is we make sure that students start all at the same time, because we want to make sure that there's that cohort formation that is so important for things like an alumni network inside an MBA program. So that's very key for me in stressing that we have the 1 and 2 year length programs. Those students are starting and they're going through the core and everything together. When it comes to avoiding tradition, we try as much as possible to, I really do believe that the strength of an MBA comes in the idea that it is a general management degree, which means on the one hand, you do need to spend time if there are new trends developing in management. That has to be part of an MBA education. But it also means that you must be well-rounded. And when I say well-rounded, I mean an MBA is something that the things that you learn pay off at different points in your career. And we want to make sure that we are giving those. And so the mix of, I would say, when we talk about avoiding tradition at McGill at this point, part of that is teaching new material, whether it be how you can incorporate things like machine learning into your businesses, how you should think about sustainability in things like operations, but also in organization design or strategy. But there's also a piece where, if you think about tradition as what was being done for the last 20 years or so in MBA education, we're actually trying to avoid that as well and go back to some older points. For example, I do think that leadership and decision-making skills are at least as, if not more important in an MBA as some of the technical skills, right, because those become obsolete very fast. The leadership and decision-making career where you really see the yield of an MBA developing.
As the academic director, we've talked about the journey and thinking about that balance of whether we define them as hard skills, technical skills, but the emphasis that you do place on personal development and leadership. So how do you embed that and ensure that it's also perhaps an experiential journey to really embed that
development? I think that this is first something that every student gets in the core of the MBA. When I think about someone who's starting an MBA program, I think there's really two different types of classes when it comes to training in an MBA. And this reflects the fact, by the way, that you often see some classes that are letter graded in MBA programs, but you'll see a lot of classes that are often pass-fail. And the reason for that is because in a letter graded class, and this might, for example, work with something like statistics, the basics of finance, or something else, there's a common floor to which you want to educate everyone up to. And how close they've reached or gone past that floor is what the letter grade is based on. And you can compare that directly across students. When we talk about things like leadership or personal development, we're actually looking at the student's growth from the first class to the last. And there you can have you can have students who arrive who are amazingly good, for example, at public speaking. And then you have others who are utterly horrified. That doesn't mean they're bad at it, but they're scared of it. And so those students may make tremendous progress over the course of the term, but they're not as good as the people who on the first day of class already had that.
Right.
But you want to make sure you track that personal growth. And so for me, it is very important that you come in with a mindset that you're focused on those individual students and you're thinking about where they started and where they're ending up. And you don't simply say, who are the 10 best in the class in this way. And I think also what that means is you have to make sure that when you're teaching things like leadership, that they have to actually practice it. Because as you know perfectly well, Matt, you can read 70 books on leadership and never be able to lead, right? You have to create situations where students can fail safely because they have to actually practice this. And so we try to create situations where students can stand up and give a presentation early in their MBA, or they can try to hold a difficult conversation in a vignette with fellow students, and they can crash and burn entirely, but in a safe environment.
Yeah.
Because it's only through that kind of practice that they're going to get better. And so developing classes where that can happen over and over, so that then when they are sort of out there with live ammunition in an internship, in a job interview or something else, they've had the opportunities to go through that. So that's a big part of how we try to foster that personal development.
We started with that point of graduation and enjoying so much, just seeing from that individual on day one and where they are about to start so many exciting opportunities that McGill MBA graduates access. What do you think are the skills, leadership and others that are really going to serve them well to be successful in business and perhaps in wider societal impact?
It's a great question. I think that if I were going to list three, the first is, I think, good leaders are comfortable with thinking about uncertainty. And by that, I do not mean that they just don't take a stand and they're completely, we're just going to take things as they land. I think good leaders, they think about things like a strategy decision prospectively. And they ask themselves, what are the things that we know? What are the assumptions that we have to make? In other words, what has to be true about the world for this plan to find out whether that's true? And how are we going to change our plan? So being comfortable dealing with uncertainty does not mean just living with uncertainty forever. It means trying to pay attention to what are the known unknowns and how do we work on developing those? And what's the next piece of information that would help clarify our thinking? And teaching people that skill. This is a version of leadership is partly about things like experimentation. It's about how could we do a pilot of this? What are we trying to learn from that pilot? What are the assumptions of our strategy? How could we test those assumptions? So those skills, first one. Second, and it's a close second, is being able to say you're sorry. I think is one of the most profound leadership skills that you can teach people in an MBA, because ultimately understanding, perspective taking of employees that you're working with, of fellow leaders, otherwise, of recognizing and separating out a decision from the person who's making the decision, and the ability to be humble, to take information in, to recognize where we've been wrong, is it's one of the hardest things to teach, because MBA students, when they start their programs, are insecure and they don't want to admit that they're scared or that they don't understand, because the whole point of an MBA is it's general management. And so there's going to be some portion of that every student is uncomfortable with. And trying to inculcate in a leader the ability to say to folks, the reason you're here on this task force is because there are things that you can do that I cannot, but together we're going to be stronger.
Right.
Training that skill is an incredibly important part of leadership. And then the third is related to saying I'm sorry, is the willingness to finally make a decision and own it, even if you are wrong. And being able to say to someone that we have done the best analysis we could. We have not overlooked anything. We've not been stupid, but one of the assumptions we had to make turned out not to be true. And so this plan has not worked. And we have to take responsibility for the future, but also I have to be willing to own a mistake and not shift the blame.
Yeah.
And they sound so basic when you put it that way. But saying to someone, thinking clearly about uncertainty, knowing when to apologize, and knowing when to own your own mistakes are actually some of the hardest things for leaders to develop. Yeah. And they're often the things that we're most impressed with when a leader actually does them.
Yeah, and the authenticity that emerges from that, with that focus on self-awareness, being comfortable with vulnerability. Applicants to the McGill MBA perhaps have been shaping ideas of, okay, after the MBA, a specific role in a specific company, and then they show up for the first day. How do you then encourage them to explore, to take risks, and really use this opportunity at McGill, to look in corners of themselves and different sectors that otherwise they wouldn't have that opportunity?
I, I think that the best way to think about this is you have to make sure that you embed that willingness to explore, and I often think about it as to fail fast
Mm.
and learn from it. That has to be embedded in the pedagogy of the classroom, and it has to be embedded in things like your career services, your student advising, and the rest. Because we can say to someone, look, actually, the stakes are lower than you might think to take a certain type of internship, because this is your chance to explore. And if you think you might like this is the moment in your life when actually the stakes are lower, because it's fixed term, you're coming back into classes, you're developing other skills so you can apply in other places later on without difficulty. So all that kind of advising is there. But students can know that intellectually without having the sense of how do I actually do that? And so I think it's very important when you're doing things like a case-based class in the first term of an MBA. I always think as a professor that I'm teaching them the material that I want them to learn in that class, but I'm also teaching them how to have that kind of discussion.
Mm.
And so it becomes incredibly important as a professor to say to someone, that answer is wrong, but I'm glad you said it. First, because I think that other students probably thought the same thing and they were scared to raise their hand.
Mm.
So you need credit for speaking up. But also, what I need as a professor is I need to figure out why you thought that was the right answer. Because when I know that, that's when I know what I need to correct in terms of what I'm teaching. And that sense of you need to be able to ask the question that makes you feel a little stupid, that you might be wrong, is often the first step. And saying to someone, you might want to take a job that you're a little worried that maybe you're not going to perform as well. But that's what you're here to do. And so ultimately, this is all about what people who study groups and teams love to call psychological safety, right? And I suspect you are familiar with the term, but just for those who may be watching this as a recording, think of this as the software of how a team functions. If the hardware is the diversity or the composition of the team, the software is, it doesn't matter if you have a bunch of different viewpoints represented on a team if people are scared to speak their minds. You'll never get the benefit of those diverse viewpoints. And so you have to create an environment where people are willing to say things, be corrected, talk, and otherwise. And so creating that in the classroom and then backing that up with student services and career advice based on that same idea, I think that's critical for helping students expand their horizon, take more chances.
And with the diversity that McGill is committed to, it's reflected, as we mentioned earlier, the percentage of international students, the different cultural perspectives that's bringing in. How do you then see that in shaping just how important diversity is? And what is McGill doing to ensure that continuing broadening pipeline of across gender, underrepresented groups, and so on?
Let me address gender first. I think that so sort of our long-term average in the MBA program at McGill Des Hôtels right now is usually between 35 and 40% female. It was much higher last year. We were at 46% female for the starting class for the incoming class this year, but it's not good enough. To be very clear, it should be 50%. We admit women at a higher rate than we admit men, but that's because, and many studies back this up elsewhere, women only apply to jobs and programs disproportionately when they feel that they're more qualified than the average man who's applying for the same position. Right. And so the pool that we see is more qualified. And I always like to explain this to people. I don't think we've done our job correctly as a field, as a collection of MBA programs, until those admission rates are actually equal. Because what's happening right now is many schools, we have a smaller share of female applicants than male. We admit women at a higher rate because the marginal woman is not applying. And then the schools end up fighting over the relatively smaller number of female admits.
Yeah.
than male admits. And part of our job because there's the competitive element of each school wanting to have the best class, but as a set of programs, we need to do things to increase that share of female applicants. And so I think one of the things that we have tried to work on very clearly is to convey to potential applicants that we are a welcoming and inclusive place. We have focused on developing more scholarship opportunities for skilled female applicants. And we have also tried to make sure that, diversity is not enough. We want to make sure that inclusion is there as well. And so we have a very strong Women's Graduate Student Association, for example. And because of how Canadian universities are set up, they have a bit of a role in the governance of the program as well. And we take a lot of that very seriously. We focus on things like students get the same kind of diversity and inclusion training, almost exactly the same as what faculty will receive at McGill. And I've been doing diversity trainings for 15 years, and I get recertified every 2 years. And I'll be honest with you, I have seen those trainings get better over time, like what we're teaching, how we conduct them, and so on. And a lot of the demand for that for students comes from the students. And so we take that seriously and we work to develop it. So that's one piece. If I can then talk briefly about geographic diversity. So at McGill, the largest single sending area is usually South Asia. As part of the former British Commonwealth, we have a long history between India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Canada as well. The second largest sending area, obviously, is Canada. We see fewer folks coming from China than we used to, for example. And I think that's part of a long-term shift in that around the world, we're seeing fewer Chinese nationals applying for MBAs outside of China, even though the total number applying for MBAs has stayed relatively constant during those years. And that's fine. In fact, that's good in the long run because it implies growth and development of graduate programs within China. I personally, and we try to keep our numbers high out of Latin America, where we have a strong experience. Admittedly, relatively few Europeans come to Canada for their MBAs. And so we sort of accept lower numbers because also there's a very robust MBA market within Europe itself. I personally think that the future of MBA education in many parts of the world runs through sub-Saharan Africa. I think that we have, first off, anyone who pays attention to long-term demographic trends knows that virtually every person that's going to be added to global population over the next 75 years will be in Africa. We're also seeing the growth of substantial middle classes in countries like Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, Ghana, and elsewhere. And again, McGill has a strong reputation in many of these countries. And the Nigerian students I've had, for example, are some of my favorites to have in the classroom. And if those kind of pipelines are very important to develop. And I have taught a lot in sub-Saharan Africa myself. They're fantastic students to teach. And I think that is one of the areas where we are steadily trying to build our network of alumni, our recruiting efforts, and so on, because I would love if we eventually sort of Canada, India, and probably sub-Saharan Africa as a whole with a disproportionate share just because of population coming from Nigeria helped comprise that class. I'd be very happy now. And that's one of the legacies I want to leave as an MBA director, is developing our reputation in many of those countries going forward.
Well, we started by talking about McGill as an institution that is, known all over the world, and hence such strong alumni chapters around the world. Perhaps if I then ask you to think about how business education itself will evolve, you talk about those shifting demographics, what that might mean in terms of pipelines, coming to the McGill MBA and for broader business education, but also in its delivery. How do you think about how the MBA continues to be so relevant, and how graduate business education is going to evolve in the coming years?
I think the great shakeout for many programs around the world in the next 10 years, we've often said, is figuring out what an MBA is for. And I know that sounds ridiculous for the director of a program to say, but what I mean is, if you were to go back 20 years, when we were sort of at peak MBA with growing applications around the world in every country, tons of schools running MBA programs, and many employers essentially treating the MBA as like the certification to start getting jobs. And what we started to see, especially in the wake of the financial crisis in 2008, was employers and schools reconsidering that model, where it just became, well, if we want certain business skills or we want certain technical skills, go get an MBA. And so instead, we've seen the hiving off of specialized masters. We need an MBA if we just want someone who is highly skilled in building certain types of financial models, but is not necessarily going to be more advanced management material right away. That person should invest in a specialized master's in management.
Right.
That's fine. And again, we have specialized masters at McGill as well. But then the question becomes, what is the value added of the MBA? And that's why I keep bringing it back to that question of general management education, leadership, decision-making, and the rest. And so I think that the shelf life of those kind of classes is longer than the technical skills classes. And so in the long run, I think one of the reasons you see business schools paying more attention to things like experiential learning in their MBA programs is, of course, student demand, but it's also more useful because those kinds of skills are taught experientially. And so, and additionally, I think there are many types of skills. Your most classic lecture-based instruction, you don't need an MBA. You don't need a residential program necessarily to learn some of those technical skills.
Right.
Coursera is a wonderful thing. YouTube's amazing. We can go through the list of places you can find that. However, it's the interpersonal interactions with people. When that is fundamental to the material that you're learning, that's the thing that we have to double down on and focus toward. And so I think that paying attention to the fact that we need fewer classes where students sit quietly while a professor hammers out equations on a chalkboard. And we need more classes where students are engaged in simulations, where they are doing vignettes, where they're working with companies, where they're putting these ideas to practice. That is the future of MBA instruction.
You've spoken very insightfully about, business school is not sort of one size fits all. It's not necessarily for everybody. So perhaps as we wrap up, just your advice for any of our viewers from all over the world and following the Centre Court events, thinking about business school, thinking about the MBA, where do you encourage them to start and how to frame that thinking?
What I usually try to explain to people is that my job is to take someone, like when it comes to recruiting, for example, or giving that advice, I'm going to take someone who has decided that they want to get an MBA, and then I want to explain to them why they should choose McGill. And I think there are a lot of good reasons people should choose McGill. We've said some of them. I could add more. But the crucial point is I don't think it's that they need to get an MBA. And I always explain to students, like, by the time you're applying for an MBA, you are a grown adult. This is a decision that you should be making yourself. We can give you information, but it's borderline unethical for us to just push you toward applying for an MBA program. I actually think the world needs fewer but better MBAs. And I think, our goal is to be one of those better MBA programs, in perpetuity. But I think that is a personal decision, and it's so important for students. You want to talk to alumni from a program. But you also want to talk to alumni from other types of programs, if there's any doubt in your mind, because you want to make that comparison. Because I am not going to be the person who advises you on whether you should get your master's in engineering instead of an MBA or the like. But I can tell you about the relative advantages of those MBAs. And I think the mistake a lot of students can make is they narrow too quickly and they decide, oh, I have to get an MBA without a lot of thought about why they're doing that degree. And if one thing should come out of this, is that you want people who really want that general management education coming in for an MBA. And for that, I think we're a very good place to do it. But if we're talking about the ability to deal with uncertainty, if we're talking about the ability to own a mistake and so on, like one of the first bits of like leadership behavior that a potential applicant to an MBA program can do is thinking through very consciously why they're applying in the first place. And thinking about the benefits and risks of doing an MBA as opposed to another degree or not. And then we can have that conversation about which school to pick.
Right. I'd characterize the McGill MBA as a place for intelligent management. You're an embodiment of that for an intelligent discussion, and I think the level of thoughtfulness and insightfulness that as I think of our viewers and taking this big next step, just for them, to really be very thoughtful, very introspective, and I think what you've shared is of immense value. Obviously, encourage them to reach out to alumni, as you said. You're a very loyal McGill MBA alumni groups from all over the world. Reach out to you and your teams. But John-Paul, thank you for joining us for Centre Court. It was great to be able to capture this and then be able to share it with such a global audience.
Oh, Matt, it's always a pleasure. I'm always enjoying talking about the program and meeting with you and Poets and Quants.